Neil Gaiman, once beloved author best known for short fiction and iconic longer stories like Neverwhere, Stardust, Sandman, Coraline, and multiple counts of extremely graphic, really horrible sexual assault. I know, I just took all the air out of the room. That got a whole lot less fun. Some folks, including myself, are finding it really difficult to separate art from artist right now. In particular because this artist spent so much time positioning himself as a safe space for women and marginalized folks, and in the meantime turned out to be precisely the sort of danger that he claimed his books were a refuge from. And also because it seems pretty clear that some of the scarier things about Ocean at the End of the Lane and some other books that he wrote are extrapolations of or representations of things that he has direct experience with in some pretty scary ways. But we're readers, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So we want things to read, and we still want that escape from the bad stuff in the world, which regrettably includes an author that we are still unpacking some big feelings about. So these are the books that I would recommend in the meantime, while we are unpacking all of our Neil Gaiman feelings. First and foremost, I have to recommend just all of the Terry Pratchett. And no, for the people who are concerned, I am not worried about Terry Pratchett being tainted in any way whatsoever by his association with Gaiman by virtue of Good Omens. In many ways, Good Omens is actually much more of a Pratchett novel than it is a Gaiman novel, and it was clearly an instance of older established author giving young hotshot author a chance. I have no issue with continuing to recommend Terry Pratchett. The dude was very cool. There's also a limit to just how disappointing he can be, given that he is no longer with us. So, anyway, my recommended entry point for Terry Pratchett is either The Wee Free Men or Wintersmith. Either way, I would start with Tiffany Aching. However, there's a lot of books. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just here to recommend books for you to read. If you really like that sort of snarky, irreverent tone that the narration of Terry Pratchett's books often take, you might really like My Lady Jane by Cynthia Hand, or My Salty Mary, which is by Cynthia Hand, Brodie Ashton, and Jodi Meadows. Those both really lean into historical characters, but make it magic and make it a little bit silly, but also weave a little bit of social commentary in. And they've been giving me a lot of solace and refuge over these last few days as the country that I live in also turns into something from which I need a little bit of an escape. If what you are really missing is dark, seedy underbelly of a city has cool street politics, the way that you get in certain parts of Neverwhere, and those street politics come with magic, you might like Jade City by Fonda Lee. Goodness knows I did. If you're really into vengeful magic that's also sort of about taking down the establishment and is really beautifully written, you might like Starling House by Alex Harrow. I read it on a plane a few days ago. I'm still thinking about it. I am from the South. I really do enjoy a book that is angry at what coal mining has done to the environment and ecology and also economy in certain parts of the United States. But even if you don't have that backing in that history, I do think that there's room for you to enjoy this book. I also think that you should look into that history because it's really ugly and also really important to know about, but I digress. If you want something that feels light and fun and is really good for escapism, especially if you struggle with depression and self-worth or self-image, I think that now is as good an opportunity as any to get into Brandon Sanderson. Don't necessarily have to start with the Cosmere. I know a lot of people who's found the Cytoverse books as their easiest entry point. Personally, my favorite character the man's ever written does come from those books. He's a flying ship that is obsessed with mushrooms. It's great. But in general, Brandon Sanderson is reliable for a good story that tugs at the heartstrings and is really good about all-encompassing, expansive fantasy. And if you really just want some good escape, he's a go-to for a reason. If what you're really struggling with is disillusionment and authors turning out to be disappointments, The Magicians by Lev Grossman. It really does not get more hyper-specific than that. And that goes double for the TV show adaptation, which I think is leaving Netflix. That's where I'd been watching it. I also watched it when it came out in the first place. I've been returning to it lately under these circumstances, specifically because of how it deals with continuing to love something even when it turns out to be incredibly disappointing. I've been looking for answers there a little bit. If you want to talk about an institution that protects people who really probably should not be protected, but you also want a magic school, Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. If you have not read it by now, what are you doing? Stop watching this video, go read Legendborn, and then come back. If you want interesting magic that is written about lyrically, I think that you might find An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson interesting. I read it. I have some conflicting feelings about it. I might do a more in-depth video about it later on. But I do think that if what you're really missing about Gaiman's books is that lyrical description of magic and the ways in which magic can be good, bad, and dangerous, An Academy for Liars is a good place to park yourself in the meantime. If you want a conversation about overlapping worlds and you want a good portal fantasy, Shades of Magic by V.E. Schwab. Get on that. Read that. If you were really into the Sandman comics and you really liked Gaiman's take on superheroes who aren't all that heroic, also V.E. Schwab, I think that you might like Vicious. If you just want a conversation about how the institutions that we live our lives in are built on problematic bones and protect people who, again, really should not be protected, but they're deemed too important to the community to allow to be brought down, Babel by R.F. Kuang, I think, is absolutely a good place to discuss. Also Yellowface, and that's really dealing with much more contemporary issues. I like to think of Yellowface very much as a horror novel about things that you think wouldn't happen in real life, except they do a whole lot more often than you think. If you want a story about gods that do and don't interact with the real world and make choices that are sometimes helpful but usually not, but consistently affect people in the real world, but also with a medieval fantasy bent, Coshiel's Legacy by Jacqueline Carey. Keep in mind there is a trigger warning for that, and take it seriously. But I have so many good things to say about that series, in particular how they handle, about how those books handle marginalized. In particular, I have very nice things to say about how those books handle more marginalized voices in a historical context while still keeping the fantasy verisimilitude alive. And that is no easy feat. So yeah, the recommendation is out there for Coshiel's Legacy. If you really, really loved Coraline and you cannot bring yourself to move on from that, I think that you might like Brave Story by Miyuki Miyabe, especially if you also really grew up on video games, if you grew up feeling like an odd one out. It's excellent. And a book that I read around the same time, I actually think that they were both given to me in the same stack of Hanukkah presents, Unlondon by China Miéville. It's basically a story about a kid who wasn't the chosen one, or she wasn't supposed to be, but the chosen one tasks still have to get done. And the setting of it really reminds me a great deal of Neverwhere, except that I like some of the creative choices made in it better. So there's that. Giraffes are scary. You should be afraid of the giraffes in those books. Yeah, giraffes are scary, ghosts are friendly, and there's a lot of made-up words that actually make more sense than words in the real world. Good stuff. And if what you want is a good animated story that you can just feel good about, Nimona by Noelle Stevenson. I think that it might scratch that itch of wanting a story that you can just feel good about in the end. A story that is snarky and irreverent and takes on systemic oppression, but also is definitely about a kid who really wants to be a supervillain, and the supervillain that they are the assistant to is like not that bad a person and definitely in love with the superhero. Good stuff. There are a lot of really good books out there that scratch the portal fantasy, magic underneath the real world, gods at the end of the world, overlapping worlds, hope in the face of defeat itch that Gaiman is so good at. And yes, for the most part, you may notice I've done my best to construct this list primarily out of books written by women and by people of color. Not entirely, but I certainly wasn't going to leave Terry Pratchett off of this list. And here's the thing. It's not that I don't think women can be problematic. Trust me, as somebody who grew up on Harry Potter and the Mists of Avalon, I know there are monsters out there in all shapes and sizes, and it is probably best to not make too much a hero out of any author and not put them on too much of a pedestal, because everybody is human and some humans are not particularly good people. In general, I think that we should be making an effort to read more marginalized voices in this day and age, and more stories written by women, especially if we're here in the US, and more stories that balance humor and sharp commentary with the acknowledgement that the world we live in is sort of burning. And while the authors on this list aren't perfect, because they are people and we probably shouldn't expect them to be perfect, they are, to the extent of my knowledge, at least trying. And to me, that's worth recommending. Please feel free to leave your own recommendations in the comments. My only request is that we not get too into the Gaiman conversation without some pretty harsh trigger warnings, because the stuff in the articles and the allegations that have come out are really, really graphic, and nobody deserves to have that shoved in their face, especially if they have experience with assault. Thank you very much. I will catch you guys in the next one. Bye.